Thank you very much, Melissa, and I love it when people talk about me in a much more accurate way than I could. But really appreciate it. And by the way, my name is Janamitra Devan, but everyone calls me Dev, and there's a very good reason for it, and I'm going to spend a few minutes explaining why. I became a U.S. citizen in 1998, of course, and of course, one of the first things that you do when you become a U.S. citizen is go out and get a passport. And so I got mine very proudly and went gallivanting around the world, and ended up in my former country now, Singapore, where I was promptly stopped by the immigration officer. And he pointed in my particulars page, and lo and behold, I was listed as a female. Right? So I said, oh boy. And he said, well, get that fixed. And so I said, I will. I'll go back and I'll do the necessary. And so I come back and I send my passport to then it was called the INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service. I said, guys, can you get this corrected? A week later, I get the passport. And when they make changes on they don't give you a new passport, but they endorse the page at the back, right? And the endorsement read, the bearer of this passport has changed his sex. And at that point, I said, no more, all right? I'm going to stop using my first name, Janamitra, because fellow Americans tend to read that as a female name because it ends with an A, right? And so that is the story of my life with regards to how I became known as Dev. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this event. Emerging markets in today's global economy, I think, faces huge, huge challenges. But I would also say that the opportunities are even larger. Now, the challenges. Here are a few of these challenges that I just want to put on as landscape challenges. On the jobs front, right, globally, there are about 200 million people who are currently unemployed. This represents an increase of 27 million people just since the financial crisis began. Right? Over and above this, about 1.5 billion people are occupying marginal jobs at best. Also, if you add on the fact that just from the expected demographic surge, right, that is going to be taking place over the next 10 to 15 years, the world would need to create 600 million jobs just to keep pace. Right? That's the magnitude of the challenge in the jobs market. A few more facts. We've got currently 2.5 billion people who are excluded from the financial markets, right? This means they don't have a savings account like you or I, or access to credit or access to insurance, etc. And we did a joint study with McKinsey a few years ago and asked a simple question, is, well, what do the poor need in terms of financial services? And that, we did extensive surveys, and what came back to us was 17 different products that they needed for financial services. And these products, if you looked at that list, there was absolutely no difference, right, from what you or I would want as products. The poor need savings instruments. The poor need insurance. Right? The poor need credit. Right? No different, except that they do it in different ways. Right? When you don't have recourse to a savings account, your savings is in the form of livestock, goats, etc. Terrible way to save. right? Because that, you can lose your entire wealth, right, if there's an untoward accident. Another fact, more than 1.2 billion people lack access to basic electricity. And this, goes beyond just the household level, right? It's SMEs, right? The small and medium enterprises, et cetera, who don't have access to electricity as well. Of this 1.2 billion people who without access to electricity, 500 million of them are in Africa, 400 million in India. Right? They're massive, massive issues of access. Infrastructure, and this is according to a study again by McKinsey, the expected need for infrastructure financing from 2013 to 2030 is $57 trillion. We're talking about a massive need and a massive opportunity, if you ask me, right? When you're looking at these staggering numbers. Now, I can go on and on. Now, there's somewhat of a silver lining, right? Despite all these challenges, we also know that the emerging markets are currently, by and large, on a growth spurt, right? They are in fact, if I'm not incorrect on this, 2/3 of global growth, right, or the delta in GDP, right, is coming from emerging markets, right? Not from the US, not from Europe, not from Japan. Right? But the problem is this, as Christine Lagarde of the IMF just said just last week, we are in a 3-speed world, right? So you've got the emerging markets gallivanting away. You've got Japan and the US, anemic growth still. Things may be changing, with the latest news that I'm reading. And you've got the Eurozone in a stall. Right? Now, this cannot mean good news for the emerging markets, right? Because ultimately, it is going to be impacting them as well. So the theme of your forum, I think, is absolutely appropriate, and it hits it on the nail. And that is that the EMs, or emerging markets, are indeed at a crossroads, right? So the current challenges and so on need to be understood, and understood well. Now, what I'd like to do is to paint to you a picture of what I see as some of the critical challenges that the emerging markets face. And I'm speaking really from the countless visits that I've had over the past 4 years working in the bank group with many of our client states, which come from as diverse, middle-income countries all the way to fragile and conflict-affected states like Afghanistan, like Iraq, a number of, I think about 25 countries in Africa alone, which are classified as fragile in economic underpinnings. So here are at least a few insights that I can come up with. Now, the first challenge that I think really the emerging markets still are grappling with, and the bank group is certainly deep in involvement in trying to help, is the scourge of corruption. Right? Unfortunately, several emerging markets are still struggling with that particular issue. Not all emerging markets. Some have, in fact, gotten over it. But in the past 4 years that I've seen, I can't, I can't say how difficult and entrenched this problem, right, is. And you'll be asking, well, why am I concerned about it? I'm in the private sector. Well, heck, this is absolutely critical, right, to a vibrant private sector. If you can't get the scourge of corruption out, right, I just don't see, sustained hope for several of these countries. So it is, make no mistake, it is really a huge issue. Now, there are countries that have certainly succeeded, right, in literally killing corruption. And I'm going to tell you a personal story, right? As Melissa indicated, I was born and grew up in Singapore. I came to this country much later. I happen to also belong to a political family. My dad was one of those revolutionaries, right, and who devoted his time to get the Brits out, right, and we eventually did, 1959. And they were faced with an enormous challenge. That first group of leaders under Lee Kuan Yew, right, and my dad was one of the gang of four, I guess, right, who formed the new government. So there was this massive problem. Singapore was better known as the Sin City, right? 30%, 35% poverty, right? I mean, you can't imagine. How many of you have been to Singapore? Right. Okay, well, you go to Singapore now and it's, it looks completely different, right? But it was a pathetic basket case, right, in many ways. Corruption was rife. Right? Now, as I was, and I tell you this story because, when in one of my visits to Africa, and I'll not name the country, but I had a meeting with one of the heads of, a head of state. And he knew my background, and so when I went in to have that courtesy, visit with him, it was 10 minutes of pleasantries, and then he dug in. He says, I want to learn about the Singapore experience. What did Singapore do? What can we learn from it? And I said, boy, okay, this is a great opportunity for me to tell him, one or two things. And I said, look, your critical challenge is fighting corruption. Okay. He said, but what do the Singapore leaders do? And then this is when I told him this story. I said, look, for years, and I was just a kid then, my dad would represent the Singapore government in major discussions, the Afro-Asian summits and so on. And every time he went, he carried a bag of powder, white powder, right? And I didn't understand what it was. I was like 8 or 9, perhaps. And years later, I asked my mom, I said, what was Dad doing carrying this bag of powder? And she looked at me quizzically and then said, oh, yes, of course. Dad carried his detergent. And here is one of the senior leaders of the Singapore government going on foreign trips, carrying his own detergent because they couldn't bring themselves to use public money to send their clothes to be laundered in 5-star hotels. Right? The reason why I say this is the signaling that needs to take place from leadership, right, to attack the problem of corruption is incredibly important. I'm not talking to you as how great my dad was. My dad is, I think he was a great guy. But it was that thinking in the leadership of Singapore that even in today's leadership, you still see. Right? Now, Singapore is a case in point, right? You cannot go and replicate the Singapores everywhere because the context is different. It's a small country. It's 245 square miles at low tide, right? So, you can't really sort of compare Singapore, but it's a lesson, right? It's a lesson in terms of what you need to do to contain corruption. And I think that if countries don't get that, if leaders don't get that, this problem will continue. So what the bank is doing about this is that when there is the political economy of development, right? You can't just set the rule books in place. You can't just set the laws in place, right, without attacking the political economy, right, of issues like corruption. So that's one. That's one set of challenges that I see still, for the development community to overcome. Second is the challenge of competitiveness in general. And here, look, the product life cycles are getting shorter. You guys know better than anyone else on that. There are labor substituting technologies, right, that are coming in droves. Low productivities of small and medium enterprises. And by the way, this is not just for the poorer countries. It also applies to the larger and more successful economies. I was just recently in Korea, right, where their number one challenge, right, is in trying to elevate productivity for their SMEs, right? What's happened is through its own development, most of their SMEs, probably 60, I was given figures like 60 to 70% of their SMEs were excluded. And what I mean by this is excluded from the chaebol system, right? So those SMEs which were tied to the value chains, right, of the chaebols benefited. But the bulk of them, 60 to 70% of them, were not ever connected to the chaebols, right? Now, as a result of that, the 60 to 70% of South Korean SMEs are at the level of productivity in 1997. Absolutely no change, right? Multiply this to any number of other countries, you've got a huge challenge of getting SMEs to be a lot more productive. And why is this important? Because it is at the root of competitiveness, right? You reduce the per unit cost of production, you become more competitive, and you can compete in today's global economies. Emerging markets need to address this. And there are literally 5 arenas that we see are deficits for most emerging economies. One, and let me predicate this by saying that when you're talking about interventions to make the private sector more effective, the private sector does not live by just finance, right? You don't, the old school of thought is just throw the money at them. In fact, I shouldn't say old school, my dear colleagues in the bank still say that, where, throw them the money, make access to finance, readily available, and everything will be fine. Well, you and I know, right, if you have been in the private sector, the private sector does not live by bread alone, right? You've got finance. You also need a whole array of other aspects. And these are the very arrays of other aspects that do not exist in many private sector environments. So what are they? One, the appropriate set of skills and capabilities, right? You go to most emerging markets, that is a basic core problem that the private sector faces. Skills and capabilities that can meet the demands of the marketplace. Now, countries have been successful in tackling that problem, right? They've, whether it's the Koreas, Malaysias, Singapore, Thailand, etc. There's several countries that you can look to who have engaged in constant upgrading of skills, both from the macroeconomic level as well as the industry level, right? Sectoral interventions to upgrade skills. Countries like, the East Asian countries are still today focusing on issues of skills building. Number 2 is getting the appropriate technology and the innovation processes going, right? You can set up any number of SMEs, but if we are not able to convey to them the need for innovation, the need for constant reinvention, etc., they run into problems. Now here I can look at an example of Thailand. Look at Thailand's food processing industry and how the Thais systematically innovated around the food processing, got their packaging technology enhanced. And 15 years ago, you couldn't find Thai products in American shelves, right? Go to the grocery stores now and you will see Thai product catered towards a particular clientele, right? So, but this involved structured thinking, structured interventions. SMEs don't have that. The third, and I won't spend too much time on this, is the access to finance, right? Access to finance is important. I'm not saying that it isn't, but we cannot be indiscriminately sending out, an SME fund that is meant for generic, a set of SMEs. There needs to be some very contained interventions on the sectors which have the highest potential for comparative advantage and competitive advantage. And in this particular arena, the bank is also doing some very interesting products, like, for example, the Early Stage Innovation Fund, which we are trying to set up in the countries of MENA, for example. MENA, is the Middle East and North African region, which everyone knows is undergoing upheaval right now. And we are asking the question, look, how could we use early stage innovation financing with the help of multilateral institutions such as ours so that we can reduce the cost of capital because of who we are, right? We're AAA rated organizations, and make those funds amenable and reachable to women-run businesses and as well as others. The fourth, infrastructure. I started off by saying that, electricity, you've got 1.2 billion people who don't have electricity. That is a serious issue. You don't have electricity, you can't run a business. Now, in this particular case, I can point to a great success story, Rwanda, right? Country that, was in the not too distant past, just came out of genocide. Leadership came together, right, and said, we need to really improve this. How many of you are familiar with the World Bank's Doing Business report? Right, it's a ranking. Okay, that is actually under my vice presidency. It's one of the proudest things that we've done as well, and that is to name and shame. Right, so rank the the countries in terms of how long it takes to start a business, how long does it take you to get a construction permit, how long does it take to resolve contractual issues, all the things that matter to businesses, but not just report them, rank them. Okay. Now, in one of the rankings was getting electricity, right? So Rwanda was way in the hundreds, right? So I don't know exactly what the specific rank was, but they took that to heart and they said, let's fix this, right? And they are now ranked number 49, right? So they've improved it. They still have challenges, right? But these are arenas that are absolutely critical. And I'm just naming one infrastructure issue, right? Let alone infrastructure, basic infrastructure on roads and bridges and, and industrial infrastructure, broadband technology, et cetera. So Rwanda, in fact, right now, it takes 30 days to connect a business with electricity supply. And compare that to Germany, which is right at the top, which takes 17 days. Right? So they're not bad, right? And they're getting there. Now, by the way, every time we say this, there's some incredulous Western politicians who refuse to accept that. Says, how can Rwanda do that? Right? Are you serious? But that's a fact. I may be impolitic in saying this, but we do get that kind of quips. Now, third one, and then I'll open it up and we can have a discussion, is what I call the organizational challenge. Right? So I went through number one, corruption; number two, the challenges of competitiveness, where I've listed the 5 arenas that I think is important. Actually, I missed one. I talked about skills. I talked about technology and innovation, access to finance, infrastructure, and the third one is investment climate. I should have mentioned it, right? But that, or rather, the fifth one is that particular area. So the third part is the problems that emerging markets have in organizing themselves. Right? It's an intangible, very difficult to put your hands on it, but ultimately, when you look at the successful factors or successful countries, 9 out of 10 times it comes down to skills in organizing themselves. How did they organize their industries, right? How did they organize their public sector, right, to be of service to the different constituents of the public? How did they organize interministerial dialogue, right, for action? Right? These are fundamental elements. Without them, you just can't have a supportive private sector environment. You can't have a supportive financial sector environment as well. So the organizational aspect, and of course, there's some countries, again, that take the cake on this, sometimes irritatingly so, right? One, in fact, my former country, it's unbelievable when you call and are seeking a phone connection or whatever. It's immediate, right? Whether it's a landline or anything else. Or the Chinese have done incredibly well, right, in this particular dimension of organization. Then again, you look at countries like India, I'm afraid, right, who are very poorly organized in several dimensions. And you see the results, right, of an economic structure it's floundering, right, to find its way. So this element of organization, we found in the bank to be a critical dimension, and so a lot of our interventions are basic at that level. How do you actually get the public sector going? How do you, provide for constant mentoring and coaching and teaching of the public sector? Right? You've got every year, out of 200 countries or so, how many new political regimes come in and are inadequately prepared, right? Because they don't know the first thing about governance, right? So should we have a role in that? Should you, in the University of Maryland, right, in the School of Business, have a role in that? And why not? All right? Could that be an arena of service that the Smith School could also be in? I'm going to stop right here, and if we could have a discussion. If you have any questions, please feel free to bring them up. Thank you.
Let me get us started off.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, thank you for your wonderful talk. So you have the advantage. You have the advantage of getting a global perspective, and you spoke very well to the challenges. So, could you speak to the future prospects as well? So, do you see things going in the right direction, or is it uneven, or how do you see the picture?
It is uneven at best, but I do see, as I indicated, I think the opportunities are clearly, surfacing. In what we are seeing for sure is opportunities in infrastructure investment, because that is really at the core, right, of what needs to be provided. So the bank and other regional development banks, bilateral governments, et cetera, are really stepping up, right, to that dimension. The big challenge, again, in that particular arena is the know-how, right, of one can talk about infrastructure easily. The software of infrastructure is incredibly difficult, right, whether it comes to working with procurement rules, within countries that are above board and so on. That's a big area. I do see opportunities certainly in various sectors, because we do see, for example, movement of entire manufacturing regimes from one country to the other. We're seeing it from China to Vietnam, Philippines, Thailand, right? That has already begun happening. And so in the dimensions that we face on the ground is trying to help the local government sense the markets. How do they, right? A lot of these local governments just don't have, right, the wherewithal or the information base, right, on how they can sense the markets so that they could be first in the line, right, with their private sector jumping in. I don't mean, for the public sector to jump into the private sector, but a little bit of a boost, right, to help in that area would make a lot of sense. These are the couple of dimensions of opportunities, but I think there are significant others as well, and besides the manufacturing shift. It is really contextual. I'll give you a specific example of what I mean by this. In FCS, or fragile and conflict-affected state, where our challenge is, how do we create jobs in that? We are looking at the opportunity space. So, for example, when a country has got thousands of UN peacekeepers down there, and these peacekeepers are importing food, right, to sustain them, we're asking the question, well, look, can't that be the incipient industry for the FCS, that country, to take advantage of? Why don't we help them do that? Why don't we put the investments in, not only from the bank, but pulling in the private sector to come in so that they begin to see, right, the opportunities themselves, right? Now, I do also see a huge opportunity for American businesses, right, in moving into these areas. But I have to say this, I think the Americans are slow on this. I think the Chinese are taking the cake on this by being incredibly aggressive in Africa and so on. We tend to belabor and ask a lot of questions on the risk dimension. Let's face it, going into any of these markets are going to be a risky proposition. Is the question of whether or not you are willing, to take that for future dividends. So the Americans have been slow on this, and so have the Europeans in this area. And I see a big opportunity. And more, to your line of business, I see a huge opportunity for making inroads as academic institutions into new areas, in Africa and so on. The field is still open there. But there's a tendency I've seen amongst American universities to focus their efforts on the established markets, right? But, you go to Singapore and Malaysia, and they're saturated down there, right? You've got Stanford, you've got Yale, you've got a whole bunch of other universities. But go into the African continent, go into, Eastern Europe and so on, and there's still quite a bit of opportunity there. Yeah.
I have a question that you mentioned that the small, medium-sized enterprises don't have the same resource as the big tech. But my question is, can small and medium enterprises also be multinational companies? Because I went to Singapore and I'm very impressed by how the government of Singapore to help the SMEs compared to in China. There are numerous of small SMEs, but the access to finance is really limited.
Yeah.
So I really want if you can share some experience with us.
Look, I think there is, as I indicated, in fighting against the Washington consensus mode, I do believe that government has a role to play in providing that lending hand, right, to SMEs. Singapore has certainly done it very, very smartly, but they also have, put in the protocols for integrity and so on, such that it doesn't become abuse, right? So you've always got to balance it off. And there's always a danger of, I believe, of putting too much into the SMEs. The idea is not to overwhelm them with finances, but to give them enough of a helping hand to get them going. So let me give you an example. And I was involved in a project when I was a young consultant in Singapore, where the Singapore government had something called the Local Industry Upgrading Program. And what that program did was they said, look, we've got a bunch of high-flying SMEs, good SMEs with potential, to really grow and become larger companies. The whole idea of SMEs is to grow them, not that they remain as SMEs, right? So what they did was they set up a hand-holding program with multinational companies, and I remember HP at that time, which was only producing calculators, right? No computers and so on, right? And they were producing calculators, but they needed technical brochures and so on to be made. So you wanted to have a local printing capability, and Singapore didn't have that, but they saw that as an opportunity, and the Singapore government identified a few companies and said, look, we will help you upgrade your skills. How are we going to do that? We're going to provide you 30% subsidy so that you can get a consultant to come in and get your bookkeeping skills up, upgrade your business planning process, etc., right? And at the same time, got the MNCs to handhold these SMEs, right? So that they adopted the processes, the international processes, and so on. Now, there's one company in particular called Stamford Press that started off as a small enterprise, which is now a huge printing house in Singapore. That was one of the beneficiaries, right, of that kind of a program. But the Singapore government did not make the mistake of giving them 100% subsidy. That would be a mistake, right, because the owner, the entrepreneur, needs to take the responsibility, right, of taking off after that. The Chinese have done, similar programs. I don't think as efficiently as some of the other countries, but certainly, and by the way, I don't want to belabor Singapore. There's so many other great examples in Malaysia, in Poland, for example, that do similar, have engaged in similar programs.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your wonderful talk and for taking my question. I'm Claire Nelson, the Futures Forum. One of the issues for SMEs in particular and some of the small economies is the issue of financing for innovation. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that as a challenge front. Mm-hmm. So is the IFC looking on, say, supporting venture capital, not just the financing, but also some of the training that maybe some of the financial companies in the emerging markets of, say, Ghana or the Caribbean, where we have scientists who are doing research on biotech, which is very promising, but there's no support to move that from their labs into R&D, and there's no way to find partnerships, say, with biotech venture capital firms like in the US or Europe. Yep. Is there any way a group like IFC could be like a bridge partner to help create this kind of this industry or strengthen these nascent industries in these countries?
Yes, indeed. And it's actually I'm a vice president of both the IFC and the bank, right? And what we've done is we created a practice called the Competitive Industries practice, which is meant specifically to go in and create public-private consortiums that would be focused on specific industry clusters, right? Clusters, or sometimes we call them growth poles and zones and so on. But the idea is to bring the capacity building up on innovation, on skills, and so on, but to help the local players take ownership of that, right? Now, the interesting approach that we are taking is that this is not just an advisory, right? We are, after all, a bank. We lend money, right? So the idea is to bring bank lending directly into these industries so that the government can then invest in the appropriate industry-specific infrastructure that is needed, right? Do you have a particular road from point A to point B that would get your goods out, right? Or do you have the types of broadband technology that is required, right, for the industry to grow? And part of these funds, right, could also be used together with the private sector to set up joint innovation centers, right, or joint incubation facilities, right, for SMEs. In fact, there's one particular outfit in my unit called InfoDev, Information for Development, not named after me, but InfoDev, that has delivered on something like 400 incubation facilities, right? So the whole idea there is, look, innovation does not take place only in Silicon Valley, right? There are budding ideas, that are coming out from especially the young, right, in a number of these emerging markets, right? So what we're trying to do is to fuel that, right? Let them rise, and then with the appropriate financing, right? Even if you get 1 out of 10, right, working on a particular idea, and being able to commercialize those ideas, you've got a big win, right? So that's what this particular practice is doing, either through, direct advisory work with bank lending and with the IFC then coming in and taking specific transactions with the private sector, right? That's what the IFC can do, right? The IFC is the private sector arm of the bank. Please.
I really enjoyed your remarks. Thank you. My name is Lester Johnson, and I spent half my life in government, half in private sector. But we've been exploring doing business in a very oil-rich West African country, large country, and your remarks on corruption. Mm-hmm. Just in the couple of years that we've been looking into this, it's like an onion almost. At first, having come from U.S. government where I didn't see very much of that kind of thing, and as we got into it, I thought, oh, well, why don't they just pass laws or something like that? Then I find out that when someone's elected, the entire family's tied in, and there's expectations in the family, and they got elected because of the support. And then you go down another level, and another level, and another level. So how do you get at that? Where do you start that? Where would a country like this one begin to make progress in that area when it seems to be so much part of the fabric, and yet I don't see the country moving beyond what it is unless it changes?
Yeah. No, look, I don't think it's a simple solution, right? And this is why I think that you've got to, in my remarks, I basically gave an indication of the importance of the political economy, right, of sending the right signals and so on. But where the bank is also stepping in is in the granular details, right, of containing corruption. How do you set up an office, right, or a corrupt practices bureau, right, of sorts that would put the processes in place, that would put the regulatory environment, the laws and so on in place. Many of these countries have the laws, right? That's not the problem. It's the enforcement of the laws, right, that gets completely distorted. So helping them in that particular aspect as well. There's another arena that we've stepped up our interventions in, and again, this bill is in my vice presidency, and that is called the STAR program, or the Stolen Asset Recovery Program, right? So, in other words, we said, let's not sit by, let's make examples, right, of those politically exposed people who have benefited from corrupt schemes. So for example, with Ben Ali in Tunisia, after he was deposed, this particular program helped to interdict. Right? Now, we don't do that, by the way. The bank does not go and handcuff people, right? But we provide the information that would then lead the Interpol and other units to go in and make the interdictions. And we recovered, 2 aircraft, right, from that family, plus $27 million or so just recently of cash from Ben Ali's wife, right? Now, the reason why we're paying attention to those things is those are strong signals that if you really go after, right, the culprits, right, that could be a huge signaling device, right, for people to know that we are not taking our eyes off you, right? We will get you. Now, the unfortunate reality of this is it is incredibly complex trying to trace stolen assets, right? Because you can be sure, right, that stolen assets have gone through Hong Kong, have gone through Singapore, have gone through Cayman Islands with a network, right, of beneficiaries that it takes years to unravel, right? That's one. Number 2 is the emerging market economies that we deal with don't even know where to begin if they were to try to, seek the funds back. So what we do, go into these countries, help them set up the financial intelligence units, right, that they require, and with training and coaching so that they understand the international flow of the international jurisprudence of governing, the recovery of stolen assets. So it is not an easy aspect as all. The only thing that I know is to keep the pressure on. But there's one other message. It takes 2 to tango in corruption, right? It is not just a public sector issue. It takes the private sector to grease the wheels, right? So it's a question of educating our private sector leaders, right, that this is not to be tolerated. So what is the message for here? I hope your ethics courses and so on work, right? Because those things are damned important, right? So that the private sector does not, fuel that flow. And on this part, I must say that the U.S. is actually way above. And ever since the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was instituted, I think in the 70s, if I'm not mistaken, the incidence of corruption by U.S. private entities has declined considerably relative to the Europeans, right? There's still a huge problem with European companies, participating in bribery and corrupt activities in a number of emerging markets.
MBA and MPP here at Maryland. So you talked a little bit about China's role in Africa and some of the things that China's doing. It's investing a lot in places like Angola, places that have really large endowments in terms of their natural resources. But there's a real issue behind Chinese investment in Africa and its ability to kind of trickle into like the SME level, trying to encourage growth in nascent industries, because a lot of times Chinese firms will, hire everything they'll import everything, even the manpower. And there's not a lot of interaction with the real economy of the countries that they're working in. So what is the bank's role in talking to emerging countries like China when they're going into the African context to make sure that they're actually doing things that really impact the real economy and really actually encourage and develop industry inside, places like Angola? Yeah.
Look, thanks for bringing that up. You hit on I think on a very important point. I did say that the Americans are slow on this and the Chinese are ahead of the game. Unfortunately, you're absolutely right. Sometimes the Chinese have not done it appropriately either, and the bank group realizes that we have, in fact, passed this message on to Chinese government officials, right, indicating that we're not happy, right, with the way. But there's only so much we can do, right? We're not political, we're not a political organization. But there has been a rash of cases, right, of Chinese investments that has not seen a single job being created that goes to the local business or that goes to, you know, hiring local. And that's sad, right? And it's not something that, that we want. And so what we have done is to constantly educate, right, the receiving government as well, to say, look, you know, don't jump at the first opportunity on a mining investment, right? You know why? Mines do not create jobs, by the way. Right? They're about the worst industry, right, to have for creating jobs. What creates the jobs are the peripheral industries, right, that support the mining sector. So yes, you can attract the investments from the MNC, from the Chinese MNC or the Indian MNC or wherever they are from, but make sure that you structure the deals such that the peripheral industries are going to be developing out of that as well, right? So there's a tag play down here, right, that we are constantly trying to push. Now, to be fair to the Chinese, I think the Chinese are also trying, they know it. Government officials know that this is taking place. And so I know that the Chinese government has been also intervening on their side, right, to make sure that it doesn't take place. Because I had a conversation with a senior minister of, in China, and I brought this up to her, and used the terms that, you know, this is neocolonialism all over again, right, except with the Chinese face, right? And it is a problem.